Okay, welcome to the final clip of this week's lecture on reflexivity and feminism. And this is the criticisms clip, as always. And really, there's so much that people have been critical about when it comes to these ideas. I mean, when I was a student, as I say, in the late 1990s in anthropology, in Britain, people were very, very kind of circumspect, shall we say, about the reflexivity that was emanating from the United States. It was still then considered to be something quite new, and in some ways an expression of a kind of something quite excessive. And as my British, or kind of British educated at least, teachers at the time would generally present it as something perhaps a little bit excessive or perhaps indulgent. And actually, if you think about the ways in which debates today about decolonization, anti-racism, and so on are being conducted, you may not be surprised at these kinds of stances that people took with regard to reflexivity at that time. They were very, very similar, often to the kind of dismissive arguments that are often made when people talk about, for example, wokeness, or all this being just identity politics, as really being part of something called kind of culture wars, which is an interesting concept which perhaps we can discuss at some point. What notion of culture is being invoked when people talk about culture wars. These are, political correctness gone wild, as people, or gone mad, as people would say. So much of this resonates with the kinds of critiques that have often, or were often, and still sometimes today are often made of the reflexive turn of the 1980s, and not least the association with the United States of America. Many people in Britain would say that debates today about, Black Lives Matter are an importation from the United States and are not really that relevant to Britain or something like that. I think a lot of people would really dispute that. But there you go. Those are the dynamics of critique, I think, that come to the fore when one thinks about the criticisms that reflexivity has been on the receiving end of. And I should also say that so much of that also goes for feminism. So certainly for a big chunk of my life, feminism was actually a dirty word. People would bulk, or balk, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Remember, I'm not English. At being called feminists or acknowledging themselves as having an affinity with feminism. It was such a kind of bad press that feminism kind of received for so long in the mainstream kind of depictions. So being a feminist, certainly when I was younger, was to be a militant, and to be inherently suspect. I think things may have shifted in more recent years to a certain extent, as far as this kind of broader representation is concerned of feminism. But it's exactly this kind of dismissal that kind of mainstream views often exercise or perform in order to marginalize these kinds of critical perspectives. So I think that's really, really interesting to bear in mind. So here are some of the ways in which writing culture, the crisis of representation, reflexivity, and actually feminism too, in some ways, were dismissed and have been dismissed. One is this idea that it's excessive. The obsession with reflexivity is obsessive. It's navel-gazing. A kind of retreat from the anthropological project, some people would say, of understanding other people and spending so much time trying to understand oneself reflexively, right? There's an old joke that one of my teachers made once. It's not a very good one. And it goes something like, what did the informant, to use that word, say to the anthropologist? What did the informant say to the reflexive anthropologist? Enough about you, can we talk about me now? So that's the kind of acerbic, kind of sarcastic dismissal that reflexive anthropology received for a long time, and maybe still does. Another kind of concern or anxiety that goes with the critical stance of reflexive anthropology in the 1980s is the anxiety that is often associated with all kind of culturalist, relativistic approaches, because reflexivity has this inherently relativizing dynamic, which is this fear of the anything goes, a kind of retreat from the scientific pursuit of truth in favor of this kind of postmodern playful experimentation. This made a lot of anthropologists, and still makes a lot of anthropologists, depending on their theoretical perspective, anxious and really skeptical of this threat of excessive relativism. Another line of dismissal and critique that has been made of these approaches has been for an excess of moralism. So this kind of identity politics, the wokeness, to use those phrases, has become a replacement in anthropology for the kind of project of trying genuinely to make sense and understand and resonate with other people's lives. And I remind you that, of course, in anthropology for a long time, this expression other people should not be mapped onto a geographical or cultural or indeed ethnic or indeed racial other, although often it is, but can be imagined in all sorts of other ways, other ways of being other, or of using the word other that are not othering necessarily, right? So, we just finished an anthropological project of UCL administrators, colleagues who work within UCL can be studied ethnographically. Anthropologists themselves can be studied ethnographically, right? Can be the object or the other to the analyst, right? So there's a very complex set of relationships there. So if anthropology is the project of understanding other people in that very broad and hopefully not always exoticizing or othering sense, then is this concern with reflexivity distracting or detracting from that project and replacing it with a kind of more morally oriented argument? Is reflexivity turning anthropology into a moral project rather than just an epistemic project? Or moralizing even project. Another critique, which actually would be my own line as usual when I look at these theoretical developments of reflexivity, regards the lurking threat of ethnocentrism that is always there. So according to some approaches, my own included, the reflexivity of the 1980s didn't go far enough. It wasn't radical enough, since it took for granted many of the categories about which we as anthropologists need to be even more reflexive than the people in the 1980s were, right? So if the reflexivity of the 1980s says that your knowledge is always situated in relation to your class positioning, your ethnicity, your gender, your sexuality, and so on, then isn't that argument taking these categories for granted as a starting point for anthropological analysis? And isn't a truly radical anthropological analysis one which would question those very categories that we use in order to constitute and construct our own positionality, right? So a kind of particular theoretical movement in anthropology that I'll mention a little bit more in the last week of this course, because it happens to be one in which I was involved, so I want to share that with you, has been tagged as the ontological turn, and I'll explain why in the last week. But that kind of approach in anthropology seeks to, the way that I understand it, really radicalize the reflexivity project within anthropology. That's also totally open to critique, by the way. Absolutely. But from its position, that would be the critique of the reflexivity of the 1980s, that it didn't go far enough. The ontological turn says reflexivity has to go all the way down. It's a never-ending process. You can never stop. You can never take anything for granted. Everything is up for grabs, including the idea of reflexivity itself, including the idea of the ontological turn itself. But we'll talk about that more in the last week. And then finally, from another angle, an angle that would be very critical of the ontological turn, for example. Perhaps the angle of contemporary critical race theory and critical gender theory as well, critical gender studies, critical sexuality studies as well, disability studies. All of those kinds of critical positionings today might look back in the 1980s and the crisis of representation and ask the question, was this really as radical as it pretended to be? Did it really make as big a difference as it should have? Why, when I look around in anthropology today, do I still see those colonial structures? Do I still see predominantly, a disproportionate power given to American, British, French, and other kind of Western, Euro-American universities, epistemological perspectives, protocols of study, ethical and research data collection and so on, done predominantly by people coming from what used to be and perhaps still is referred to as the West, going to non-Western places and so on. This is still going on. These colonial structures are still there. Why am I, one of your teachers in UCL and so many other teachers here at UCL and in so many other institutions in which anthropology get taught, still predominantly white, also middle class, also heterosexual. I mean, a whole array of kind of protected characteristics are still marginalized and excluded from anthropology. These are the kinds of questions that the summer of 2020, Black Lives Matter have put on very much on the table for discussion. And from the vantage point of our age, maybe all that heat that was generated around the crisis of representation in the 1980s didn't actually make anywhere near the amount of difference it should have made. That's the kind of critique that, for example, the Jobson article that we looked at in the very first week would mount, right, against these kind of critical perspectives of the 1980s. They were not nearly efficacious enough in changing the inner dynamics of anthropology. That's not to say that they're not relevant. That's not to say that they don't inform these very critical debates that are reflecting back on them and not finding them efficacious enough, right? So as always, there's complexity, nuance, and tension in these critiques and in these debates. And there's no vantage point from which you can say that you're fully in possession of a definitive truth on any of these questions. And that statement itself is, of course, a profoundly reflexivist statement. So I'll end this week's lecture on that positive note.